Have you ever seen something that just makes you stop and think, wait a minute, how does that even work?
Like, what do you mean?
Well, Kesser and Steen were watching this video about natural fertilizers
Okay.
and how to, manage the soil. And it had all these, really out there ideas about elements changing, you know?
Right.
And they just couldn't wrap their heads around it, especially after what they learned in class from Mr. Hendricks about Bohr's atomic model.
Oh, yeah. I could see how that would be confusing.
Right. It was like two completely different worlds. And since so many people are into this whole natural fertilizer thing, we thought we'd do a deep dive into it.
I think that's a great idea. It's always fascinating to see how people react when they come across something that challenges their understanding of how the world works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So for this deep dive, we're basically following Kesser and Steen's thought process.
Okay.
We've got their initial reaction like, huh, what? And then we've got their textbook, which lays out the basics of chemistry.
Right.
And then what they talked about with Professor Hendricks about Bohr and the periodic table.
And then to really get into it, we've got excerpts from this book called Biological Transmutation, which focuses on the work of this French engineer named Corentin Louis Kervran.
Okay, I've heard of him.
Yeah, so our mission basically is to figure out what this whole idea of biological transmutation is all about.
Right.
Like, can living things actually change one element into another?
Yeah.
And how does that fit in with what we know about atoms? And ultimately, we want to see what this could mean for natural fertilizers and keeping our soil healthy, which is what Kesser and Steen are really interested in.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? If nature has figured out a way to transmute elements that could have huge implications for how we think about agriculture and sustainability.
Exactly. So let's start with this Kervran guy.
Okay.
He lived from 1901 to 1983,
Right.
and he basically came up with this theory of biological transmutations.
So he's the one who really popularized this idea.
Yeah, his big claim was that living organisms can actually transform one element into another, which is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it, because it goes against everything we learned in chemistry class.
I know, right? But what's really interesting is that Kervran wasn't a biologist or a chemist. He was an engineer.
Oh, that's interesting. Maybe that's why he was able to look at things from a different perspective.
Yeah, maybe. So anyway, he based his theory on some really weird stuff he observed.
Like what?
Well, one example is his work with chickens.
Chickens.
Yeah, apparently he noticed that these chickens were producing way more calcium in their eggshells than they were getting from their food.
Really?
Yeah, there was more calcium coming out than going in.
That's strange.
Right. So he proposed that the chickens were somehow converting other elements, like maybe potassium, into calcium inside their bodies.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim.
I know, and that's exactly what got Kesser and Steen so fired up.
So they were convinced.
Well, Steen apparently saw something similar in that video about calcium to magnesium transmutation. Yeah, and he runs to Kesser all excited, phone in hand, and he's like, is magnesium like a parking space for calcium, including oxygen?
Uh-huh. That's a great analogy.
Right. They're trying to figure out how this could even be possible.
That's like they're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah, and then Kesser chimes in with this idea that the world is like a giant pile of Legos that you can put together in tons of different ways.
So they're thinking about elements as these fundamental building blocks.
Exactly like how you can make anything you want with Legos.
Mm-hmm.
But then Steen throws a curveball. He's like, what if it's biology that's controlling these elemental changes?
So he's thinking about a biological mechanism.
Yeah, maybe tiny organisms like bacteria are somehow orchestrating these transformations without needing some huge energy source.
Interesting. So they're not just thinking about elements rearranging themselves. They're thinking about something more fundamental, like the actual identity of the atoms changing.
Exactly. And that's where Professor Hendricks comes in to try and set them straight.
Right, bring them back to reality.
Yeah, he reminds them about Bohr's atomic model.
Ah, yes, the classic model of the atom.
Right. And even though it's been updated a lot since then, it was super important for explaining how different elements emit different colors of light.
Absolutely. That's how we can identify elements in stars and other celestial objects.
Exactly. So Bohr's model gave us this picture of electrons orbiting a nucleus in specific energy levels.
Like planets around the sun.
Sort of, but the key takeaway is that it established the idea of elements as distinct and relatively stable entities.
Right. Each element has a unique atomic structure defined by the number of protons in its nucleus.
And that's where it clashes with this whole biological transmutation thing.
Yeah, because the traditional view is that elements don't just spontaneously change into each other.
Right, except for radioactive decay.
Yeah, that's the exception.
So to really understand what we're talking about here, let's go back to the very basics. What exactly defines an element?
Okay, so an element is defined by the number of protons in the nucleus of its atoms. That's called the atomic number. So, for example, every carbon atom has 6 protons. If you change that number, you change the element.
Got it.
Now, the chemical reactions we see in everyday life and in biology mostly involve electrons. Those are the negatively charged particles that orbit the nucleus.
Right.
These electrons interact with each other to form and break chemical bonds.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't affect the nucleus, so they don't change the element itself.
Okay, so if you want to actually change one element into another, you need to mess with the nucleus, with the protons and neutrons inside.
Exactly, and that typically requires a huge amount of energy, way more than what you find in living organisms.
Like how much energy are we talking about?
Well, think about the sun. That's where hydrogen atoms are forced together under immense pressure and heat to create helium.
Yeah.
And that releases a tremendous amount of energy in the process.
Right, or scientists use particle accelerators to smash atoms together at high speeds to create new elements.
Exactly. So nuclear transmutation, the process of actually changing one element into another is real, but it typically requires these extreme conditions that you don't find in living things.
Okay, so now let's go back to these claims of biological transmutation.
Okay.
Like the example we mentioned before about calcium showing up in plants even though there's no calcium in the soil.
Right.
Some people suggest that maybe the plants are converting potassium into calcium.
So what does science say about that?
Well, while those observations are interesting, they haven't been confirmed under rigorous scientific conditions.
Right.
The vast majority of evidence from nuclear physics and chemistry supports the idea that elements are stable under normal biological conditions.
Yeah, if there was a process that could change the nucleus of an atom at room temperature without a massive energy input, that would completely upend our understanding of physics.
It's almost like we're talking about alchemy turning lead into gold.
Exactly. Alchemy was this ancient pursuit of trying to transmute base metals into precious metals. And while alchemists did make some contributions to early chemistry, their ultimate goal of elemental transmutation was never achieved.
Right, but now with modern nuclear physics, we can actually do transmutation.
Yeah, but it requires very specific and energy-intensive methods.
Right?
Like we talked about before, stellar nucleosynthesis in stars and radioactive decay are natural forms of transmutation. But again, those happen under very different conditions than what you find in living things.
So basically, if someone's claiming that biological transmutation is happening, they need to back it up with some serious evidence.
Absolutely. They need to show repeatable experiments with clear, measurable changes in the elemental composition of a biological system. And they need to explain how this is happening without violating the laws of physics.
Right, like where's the energy coming from?
Exactly.
Now, the sources do point out that Bohr's model isn't the be-all and end-all of atomic structure.
Of course not. Science is always evolving.
Right, and they mention that when Kesser thinks about the nucleus as Legos in a crystallized structure, he's actually touching on some more advanced ideas.
Interesting. What do they mean by that?
Well, Bohr's model is a simplified picture that helps us understand the basics, but modern nuclear physics goes much deeper into the structure of the nucleus.
Okay.
There are concepts like the nuclear shell model, which describes how protons and neutrons are arranged in energy levels within the nucleus, and nuclear pairing, which suggests that certain combinations of protons and neutrons are more stable.
Right. So the nucleus isn't just a random jumble of particles. It has its own internal organization and rules.
Exactly, and that's what Kesser's Lego analogy is hinting at.
Yeah, even though it's a simple analogy, it captures the idea that the nucleus is more complex than we might initially think.
Right, and this brings us back to the energy problem.
Okay.
If biological transmutation is really happening inside a plant or an animal, where does the energy come from to change the nucleus?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, because we know that overcoming the strong nuclear force requires massive amounts of energy like what you find in stars or particle accelerators.
Exactly, and living things operate at much lower temperatures and pressures. So if transmutation is happening biologically, there must be some unknown mechanism that can facilitate nuclear changes without these extreme conditions.
Like some kind of biological loophole in the laws of physics?
Yeah, essentially, and that's a big hurdle for this theory to overcome.
So if direct proof of biological transmutation is so hard to find, could scientists look for indirect clues instead?
Like, what do you mean?
Well, maybe they could look for unexpected changes in the amounts of certain elements in a biological system that can't be explained by normal biological or chemical processes.
Ah, so like if you find a plant that's suddenly enriched in a certain element, even though it shouldn't be possible based on what we know?
Exactly, but the measurements would have to be super precise to rule out any other explanations.
Yeah, that would be crucial.
Now, this leads into something that Kesser noticed about iron, manganese, phosphorus, and aluminum in the soil.
What about them?
Well, he observed that they seem to be interconnected, but aluminum stood out to him because it doesn't have a clear, essential role in most biological systems.
That's a good point. Iron, manganese, and phosphorus are all essential nutrients for plants and animals.
Right. Iron is involved in oxygen transport and enzyme function. Manganese is important for photosynthesis and other metabolic processes. And phosphorus is a key component of DNA, RNA, and ATP.
Yeah, those are all vital for life.
But aluminum is different. It doesn't really have a known biological function, and it can actually be harmful to plants.
Right, it can bind to phosphorus in the soil and make it harder for plants to absorb.
Exactly. So Kesser's observation raises the question of why is aluminum so abundant in the Earth's crust if it's not really used by living things?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery.
And of course, Steen, being Steen, he jokes about dinosaurs melting and turning into aluminum.
Well, that's one theory.
But it does highlight the fact that aluminum is everywhere, even though it doesn't seem to be doing much for life.
Right, it could just be a byproduct of geological processes, or maybe there's some undiscovered biological role that we don't know about yet.
Maybe, but it's still pretty weird.
Yeah, it is.
Now, speaking of natural cycles, the sources mention this amazing phenomenon of Sahara dust traveling across the Atlantic Ocean and fertilizing the Amazon rainforest.
I've heard of that. That's incredible.
Right. These dust clouds carry phosphorus and other essential minerals, and they deposit them in the Amazon, which helps to support the lush vegetation.
Wow, so nature has its own way of transporting nutrients over vast distances.
Exactly. It's like nature's own fertilizer delivery system.
And it's completely independent of anything humans do.
Right. It's a reminder that our planet has these incredible biogeochemical cycles that have been operating for billions of years.
Yeah, it makes you realize how interconnected everything is.
Now, shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about the difference between a hydrogen atom and a hydrogen ion. Kesser was really curious about this.
So what's the difference?
Well, a hydrogen atom is the simplest atom. It has one proton and one electron.
Right.
And that one electron is super important because it determines how hydrogen interacts with other atoms.
Yeah, it's what allows hydrogen to form bonds and create molecules.
Exactly, but a hydrogen ion is different.
How so?
Well, it's basically just a proton. It's lost its electron.
So it has a positive charge.
Yeah, and that makes it incredibly reactive. It's always looking for an electron to steal.
So it's like a tiny little thief.
Yeah, and that's why hydrogen ions are so important in chemistry and biology.
Right, they're involved in acid-base reactions, and they play a role in lots of other processes.
Exactly. The sources use this great analogy. They describe a hydrogen atom as a calm-contained particle and a hydrogen ion as a restless force of nature.
I like that.
Right? It really captures the difference in their behavior.
Yeah, the electron in a hydrogen atom keeps it balanced and stable, but the hydrogen ion is constantly seeking to interact and stabilize itself.
Exactly. So even though it's just a tiny difference in structure, it has huge consequences for how they behave.
That's chemistry for you. Small changes can have big effects.
So to sum up, we've got this fascinating tension between the established science of atomic structure and these really intriguing but unproven ideas about biological transmutation.
Yeah, it's a clash between what we think we know and what some people believe might be possible.
Right, and it really highlights how science is a constant process of questioning, observing, and testing our understanding.
Exactly. We have to be open to new ideas, but we also have to be critical and demand evidence.
Absolutely, and I think Kesser and Steen embody that scientific spirit.
Yeah, they're not afraid to ask tough questions and explore unconventional ideas.
And that's what makes them so great.
Absolutely.
So to leave you with something to think about, our listener nature is full of amazing solutions to all sorts of problems.
Like what?
Well, think about photosynthesis. That's a process that we're still trying to fully understand. but it allows plants to capture energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy.
Right.
Or the way that nutrients are transported across continents and dust clouds. That's another incredible feat of nature.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
So given all the amazing things that nature can do, is it really that far-fetched to think that there might be undiscovered biological mechanisms that could allow for elemental transformations under normal conditions?
That's a good question.
And if such a phenomenon were real, what kind of evidence would it take to convince the scientific community?
That's the challenge, isn't it? We need to be open to new possibilities, but we also need to be rigorous in our pursuit of evidence.
Exactly. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and who knows, maybe one day we'll unlock the secrets of biological transmutation.
Or maybe we'll discover something even more amazing.
Yeah, the possibilities are endless. Have you ever seen something that just makes you stop and think, wait a minute, how does that even work?
Like, what do you mean?